I recall vividly when I first became Secretary of the Treasury, we had just established the first community development office in the history of the Treasury Department to focus on inner cities, on poverty, on distressed rural areas as an economic priority. I received a call from a senior member of the United States Senate, and he asked me to come to the Hill, which I, of course, did. When I got there, the senator asked me, and this is a rough paraphrase, "You're Secretary of the Treasury. Your job is economic policy. What are you doing focusing on these community development programs?" And I responded, again, this is a paraphrase, "Senator, I respectfully disagree. I believe that poverty is very much my business and that poverty is a critical economic priority." And after I left, what I wished I'd added is that these programs that we're involved with are public investments and they have a high rate of return. My conversation with the senator illustrates a view that I developed long before I came to Treasury, which is that poverty is a social issue, poverty is a compelling moral issue, but that what most people don't recognize is that poverty is also a profoundly important economic issue. As such, it affects not just the poor, but all of us. While living in Manhattan in the 1970s, I became increasingly troubled by the conditions of New Yorkers who lived not many blocks away from me. So I reached out to find out what the conditions were that affected their lives and what was being done to help them. Through the police commissioner's office, I was put in touch with a detective, Warren Blake. Warren ran the 28th Precinct Community Council, which was a group of police officers and neighborhood leaders, and he invited me to attend the meetings, which I did. And sometimes after a meeting, Warren and his partner and I would walk in the neighborhood. And what I met as we talked to people were good people who were dealing with distressingly adverse circumstances. A few years later, I read a book by Ken Oleta entitled The Underclass. In it, Ken, who was a writer for the New Yorker magazine, presented poverty, the kind of poverty I had seen in central Harlem, as part of a systemic problem of poverty being replicated from generation through generation because our nation had not dealt with its history. 33 years have passed since Ken wrote that gripping book, and that persistence of poverty from generation to generation continues. In the United States of America, the wealthiest country in the world, 1 in 6 Americans live in poverty. If the past is any guide, roughly 40% of Americans will spend at least 1 year in poverty between the ages of 25 and 40. And 1 in 5 American school children live in poverty. That is 1 in 5 kids. That is truly outrageous. Many people think that poverty is someone else's problem, but that view is wrong. Equipping the poor to successfully enter the economic mainstream is vitally important to our economy, to our competitiveness, and to all of us, because it would reduce social costs and because of the enormous gains in productivity that could be had. For example, research clearly demonstrates that childhood poverty reduces GDP, reduces productivity, increases healthcare costs, and increases crime. Just think of how our economy and our country would benefit if we could all marshal the resources and the will to combat poverty effectively. It would be the right thing to do, but it would also be the smart thing to do. One major impediment to moving forward on policies to address poverty, an impediment that I encountered frequently when I used to go to the Hill to advocate for these policies, is the widely held view that nothing works. But that view is simply not true. Here's a great example of something that works and works powerfully, and that is the Earned Income Tax Credit, the EITC. When I first got to the White House as President Clinton's National Economic Advisor, I'd never heard of the EITC, but I soon recognized its enormously powerful impact. The EITC is a federal payment to supplement the incomes of low-income or lower-income working Americans, and it has kept millions of children out of poverty. It rewards work, And as I said a moment ago, it moves people out of poverty, particularly affecting millions of children. Many other federal anti-poverty programs have also had real effect. Over the last 5 decades, Social Security has reduced poverty amongst the elderly from roughly 47% in 1967 to 15% in 2012. Year after year, programs like Social Security, unemployment insurance, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, which we now call, or at least I still call, food stamps, though that is no longer its formal name, the child tax credit, and so much else, keep millions and millions of people out of poverty. In addition to national programs, the federal government is also making a huge difference by helping communities revitalize distressed neighborhoods. Most notably, the federal low-income housing tax credit has been instrumental in financing 90% of affordable housing for lower-income Americans. When I was still at Treasury, I saw the power of neighborhood revitalization when I visited the South Bronx, which in those days was a symbol of urban poverty. I got to the South Bronx and I expected to see a few renovated buildings, maybe a few renovated blocks. But instead what I saw was block after block after block of renovated housing, retail stores, safer streets, and a real community. The transformation was the result of local leadership supported by the low-income housing tax credit and by funding that had been organized by the leading national community development organization in the country. That organization is called the Local Initiative Support Corporation, LISC. LISC is a bland name for a robust and extraordinarily effective anti-poverty organization. It channels almost $1 billion a year into inner cities and distressed rural neighborhoods every year. LISC brings together 2 groups into partnership. One are neighborhood leaders and local businesses who design programs for their own neighborhoods. And the other are corporate and financial investors, the federal government, and as I mentioned a moment ago, the low-income housing tax credit, along with foundations, who provide the funding for these programs. LISC so enormously impressed me that when I left the Treasury Department, the first decision I made was to join the board of LISC as its chairman. And I have had the privilege of serving in that position now for 16 years. LISC facilitates, or has facilitated, almost $15 billion of investment into inner cities and distressed rural areas. And that's going into renovated housing, retail space, educational facilities, and so much else to take areas that have been viewed as hopeless and turn them into real communities. Federal measures like the Earned Income Tax Credit and community-led efforts like those supported by LISC make a real difference, and they work. But there is another critical player in the effort to combat poverty effectively, and that is you. Government programs, whether national or local, are often under attack, and they will not be saved, and I know this from my own experience from having spent so much time on the Hill working to save them. They will not be saved or expanded, as I believe they should be, unless we all get energetically involved in supporting the programs that work. We can all pitch in by writing letters to the editor, writing letters to our congresspeople, participating in town meetings with our elected officials, and doing all else that is possible in our democracy to make our voices heard. The Earned Income Tax Credit, for example, which, as I mentioned a moment ago, is critical in the effort to combat poverty, has certain key provisions that are slated to expire in 2017. That would be terrible. What we should all do is call on our members of Congress to make the EITC permanent, and then to expand it to include those who are not adequately covered under the current provisions. You can also strengthen the efforts of community development by getting engaged. You can provide your time, your expertise, your resources. If you go to a local church or you go to a local LISC office, they can refer you to community development organizations. They exist in all 50 states and in many, many communities throughout the country. The cycle of poverty, the cycle that was so well described by Ken Oleta, from generation to generation, must end. 1 out of every 5 kids living in poverty in this, the wealthiest country in the world, is simply inexcusable and outrageous. There are many strategies and approaches that work. I've mentioned a few, and there are many more. Over time, if we make the necessary investment and we marshal the resources, we can cut poverty, and we can cut it and cut it and cut it until we break the chain. But that's only going to happen if we all engage together in supporting the many programs that work. Together we can and we must fight poverty effectively. Together we can meet this profound moral, social, and economic challenge, not just for the poor, but for all of us. Thank you.